Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today, we're tackling some recent events, but through a pretty unique lens. We're going to be looking at the analysis of Uruguayan author and scholar Jorge Majfud.
Okay.
Now, he's really known for having a sharp eye for power dynamics and how they kind of play out over history.
Yeah.
So what can his perspective tell us about these protests? We're going to be getting into some fascinating ideas like the power of language, historical context, and even the role of financial institutions, all through Majfud's lens.
Well, Majfud is definitely someone who makes you think, and his analysis really gives us a framework for looking at these complicated issues in a whole new light.
One of the things that really stuck out to me was this idea of a battle for language.
Okay.
Majfud argues that empires have historically controlled narratives by controlling the actual language that we use.
Right.
And he sees that happening today, too.
And the fascinating thing is he brings it to a very concrete example.
Okay.
Which is that shift in terminology we're seeing around Israel. You know how some people are using the term Zionist regime instead of Jewish state?
Right.
Well, Majfud argues this is a sign of a challenge to the established narratives, you know? It might seem like a small change, but it reflects a deeper shift in the power dynamics.
Yeah, it's also like reclaiming control of the narrative.
Right.
Like by changing the language, you're changing how people think about the issue.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, how often do we just kind of accept the language we're given, and how is that shaping our perceptions?
That's a great point.
And Majfud also draws parallels between current protests and some historical student movements.
Yeah, he makes the argument that student activism has often been a real catalyst for social change.
Speaking of historical comparisons, didn't a U.S. congressman recently compare campus protests to Nazi Germany?
He did.
I remember hearing something about that.
Yeah, Speaker Mike Johnson made that comparison during a Holocaust remembrance speech.
Oh, wow.
Which, as you can imagine, sparked quite a debate.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Some people question how legitimate student activism actually is,
Right.
while others warn against oversimplifying these complex situations by using historical comparisons.
Yeah.
Majfud encourages us to really think about this tension. Like, are these comparisons helpful, or do they just obscure the nuances of each situation?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because history can be so illuminating.
It can?
But it can also be really misleading depending on how it's used.
Right.
But let's kind of shift gears a little bit here.
Okay.
Majfud also looks at the financial side of all this.
He does.
Specifically the role of university endowments.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
So Majfud points out that many universities have these massive endowments managed by giant financial institutions like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street.
Okay, yeah.
These firms are often called the Big Three, and they manage trillions of dollars globally, giving them immense influence over tons of industries.
So what does this have to do with student protests?
Well, Majfud argues that students are essentially funding institutions they might actually object to through their tuition and fees.
Oh, interesting.
And he highlights this idea of divestment as a form of protest.
Divestment? Could you break that down a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. So divestment is basically when an institution chooses to pull its investments from a specific company or industry.
Okay.
And they do this for ethical or political reasons.
Right.
So Majfud actually cites examples like Wesleyan, Brown, Northwestern, and Rutgers,
where
students successfully pushed for divestment from things like fossil fuels, private prisons, and companies involved in the Israeli occupation.
So it's like students saying, hey, if you're going to invest our money, do it in a way that actually aligns with our values.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Majfud argues that this is a direct challenge to those established financial power structures.
Yeah.
By targeting the financial interests of these institutions, students are forcing them to pay attention and reconsider their strategies.
It makes you think about all the different power dynamics at play here.
It does.
Students aren't just voicing their dissent. They're actually trying to influence where the money goes.
Right.
And we can't forget about student debt.
Oh, absolutely.
Majfud points out this kind of interesting contrast.
Yeah.
Where students are dealing with these huge loans.
Right.
But their tuition dollars are potentially being invested in ways that go against their values.
Absolutely. And that's a pretty thought-provoking idea.
It is.
It raises the question of whether universities have a responsibility to think about the ethical side of their investments.
Yeah.
Especially considering the financial burden so many students face.
That's a great point. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It is.
But Majfud's analysis definitely helps us understand how language history and financial power are all intertwined.
It really does. Yeah, it really does make you think about where our money goes.
Yeah.
And what it supports.
Right.
And, especially for students who are already struggling with debt, that question becomes even more important.
It does. And Mahfud seems to suggest that these protests aren't just about, specific issues.
Right.
It's more like a pushback against these systems of power.
It is. And one of the ways this shows up is through those divestment campaigns we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Mahfud sees them as this powerful tool for challenging the way things are, pushing back against these big financial interests that have been in place for so long.
Yeah. It's a pretty fascinating concept.
It is.
It's not just about, voicing your opinion. It's actually about putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly.
But how effective can these campaigns actually be? I mean, can student pressure really make a difference when you're going up against these giant financial corporations?
That's a question that Mahfud grapples with, too. He admits that divestment isn't some kind of magical solution.
Right.
These are complicated systems with lots of different players and interests, all kind of pushing and pulling.
But what's the point then?
Right.
If it's not about, completely taking down these companies financially, what are they trying to achieve?
Well, it's about more than just the immediate financial impact.
Yeah.
It's about raising awareness, changing public opinion and building momentum.
Oh, so like a snowball effect.
Yeah.
So one university divests, then another and another, and pretty soon these companies are under real pressure to change how they do business.
Exactly. It's about sending a message not just to those specific companies, but to everyone, that these practices aren't acceptable anymore.
Right.
And it's also about giving students that sense of power, that they can actually make a difference.
Yeah.
They can use their collective power to create change.
It's really inspiring to see young people taking a stand like this.
It is.
But let's be real, there got to be some potential downsides to this whole divestment thing, right?
Sure.
Isn't there a risk that universities could end up hurting themselves financially in the process?
Yeah, that's a valid concern, and it's one that critics of divestment bring up all the time. They argue that it could have a negative impact on university endowments,
Right.
which could then lead to cuts in programs or even tuition increases.
Yeah, makes sense.
And there's also the worry that it might limit academic freedom, discouraging universities from doing research in certain controversial areas.
So it sounds like it's a real balancing act.
It is.
You want to be socially responsible,
Right.
but you also have to make sure the university can actually function.
Exactly. And Mahfud doesn't shy away from that complexity, He acknowledges that there are potential downsides, but ultimately he believes that the ethical considerations are more important than the financial risks. He thinks that universities have a moral obligation to make sure their investments match up with their values.
So it's kind of like universities taking a stand for what they believe in,
Yeah.
even if it costs them something.
Right.
That's a pretty powerful message.
It is, and it goes back to that whole idea of a power shift that Mahfud talks about. All of these student protests, these divestment campaigns, it's all part of this bigger movement that's challenging the way things have always been done. It's about redefining what power actually looks like and who gets to use it.
It's both exciting and a little scary, right?
It is.
Exciting because it shows that change is possible.
Yeah.
But scary because we're talking about these huge systemic issues that won't be fixed overnight.
Absolutely.
No.
It's a long process that requires a lot of effort and a willingness to challenge those existing structures.
Yeah.
But Mahfud's analysis gives us a way to understand all these complicated dynamics, and it empowers us to actually do something, become active participants in shaping the future.
So much has been uncovered in this deep dive about these protests and all the forces behind them.
Right.
What stands out to you as the most significant takeaway from Mahfud's perspective?
I think for me, it's realizing that all these things we've been talking about,
Yeah.
the protests on campuses, the divestment campaigns, these debates about language,
Right. Yeah.
they're all connected. They're all part of this bigger struggle over power, for control over the stories that shape our world.
Right.
And that's what makes Mahfud's work so interesting.
Okay.
He helps us see that bigger picture, those underlying forces driving these conflicts.
It's like we've been focused on these individual events,
Yeah.
and Mahfud is pulling back and showing us the whole landscape.
Exactly.
And it's a landscape that's always changing, always in motion.
It is. And it reminds us that we're not just watching these changes happen.
Yeah.
We're part of them, whether we realize it or not. Our choices, our actions, our words,
Right.
they all play a role in shaping the world around us.
So if Mahfud's right, and we are seeing this big shift in power dynamics,
Yeah.
what could the long-term consequences be? What does this mean for the future?
Well, if this movement keeps gaining traction,
Yeah.
it's possible we'll see a pretty major restructuring of power.
Okay.
Not just on college campuses, but across society as a whole.
So you're saying this can be way bigger than just student protests?
It could be. We might see a shift away from those traditional top-down hierarchies, the ones that have been in charge for so long,
Right.
and maybe a move towards more decentralized models of governance, where more people have a say.
So like more power to the people.
Exactly. And with that, we might see a bigger focus on social responsibility,
Right.
on ethical investments, and a more fair distribution of resources.
Right.
And we might even see a new generation of leaders emerge, leaders who are more in tune with the needs and values of a changing world.
It's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
But it's also a little overwhelming.
It is.
It's hard to picture what that world would actually look like.
It is.
Are we really at the beginning of such a big transformation?
It's hard to say for sure, but Majfud's work suggests that it's possible.
Okay.
Of course, these kinds of changes don't happen overnight.
Right.
It's a long process that needs continuous effort, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
So it's like a call to action.
It is.
A reminder that we all have part to play in shaping the future.
Exactly. And Majfud doesn't try to give us all the answers, but he encourages us to really think about these issues, to learn more and to be part of these important conversations about power, justice, and the kind of world we want to build.
Well, this deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has.
We've explored some complex topics, challenged our assumptions, and gained valuable insights from Majfud's perspective.
Absolutely.
So what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I hope they come away feeling a sense of both possibility and responsibility.
Okay.
Possibility, because Majfud's analysis shows us that change can happen, even when things seem really difficult. And responsibility, because we all have a role to play in making that change happen. It starts with being aware, questioning the stories we're told, and understanding how power works.
So it's not just about understanding these issues. It's about actually doing something.
Exactly.
It's about using our voices, our choices, and our collective strength to create a more just and equitable world.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been another fascinating deep dive, and we encourage all of you to keep exploring these ideas.
Yes.
And to think about your own role in shaping the future.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening, everybody.